One of the joys of working at a magazine is you get to write, or try to write, the first draft of history. And sometimes you get to even step back and do a little bit more, like we at Time try to step back and do Man of the Year, which our guest tonight was Man of the Year in 1988. And then every now and then you step back even more. And once we did a Man of the Decade, and that was our guest tonight too, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Man of the Decade for the 1990s. And as we look ahead a bit and think of the end of this century, you think there are only a handful of people who you might be considering for Woman or Man of the Century. And I do think that our guest tonight falls into that category. Most of us in this room have spent most of our lives sort of under the fear of nuclear destruction. Mikhail Gorbachev helped lift that fear. In addition, he helped lift the hand of repression from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And like Alexander II before him, he helped remove a form of slavery from his people. Unlike Alexander II, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. From 1985 to 1991, he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Premier, and then the President of the Soviet Union. After facing down a coup in 1991 with the somewhat awkward help of Boris Yeltsin, he stepped down as the Soviet Union broke up. And I guess that was another great act of peace, too, to show that a leader of the Soviet Union could be part of a transition of power that was peaceful. He's now president of the Green Cross International, which is affiliated with the Global Green USA organization here. He's written a marvelous book which looks incredibly intimidating in its size. It's by Doubleday, and I notice Doubleday uses thick paper because it's a fast read and not quite as long as it looks. I read it over the week, and I hope you will read it too. It's a great pleasure of mine to introduce a true giant in history of the 20th century, Mikhail Gorbachev. Please. That's right. I'd also like to introduce Mrs. Gorbachev, Raisa Gorbachev. Right? Can I see you there? And for those of you in the room, I think most of you are, who are aficionados of Russian relationships, I'd also like to introduce Pavel Palashchenko. Most of you know who he is. He's been there with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze over the years, and by the way, he has a book coming out too, if I may say so, in February. He will not translate this for the Mr. Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev says I have been criticizing him because I cannot hear the translation.
Okay, let me start in with the questioning, and I want to start with a tough subject, which is Boris Yeltsin.
С вопроса на трудную тему. Это тема Борис Ельцин.
In your book, you say he has a lust for power, he's lacking in self-control, he's unbalanced, and he's not coherent.
Что ему нужна только власть. What was the last one?
Not coherent.
И что то, что в нем трудно разобраться, так сказать.
Do you regret bringing him to Moscow?
Вы сожалеете о том, что вы призвали его в Москву? So far as Yeltsin is concerned, I regret but one thing. That after, in 1987, he so much insisted on his resignation. He wanted to resign as first secretary of Moscow City Committee of the Communist Party. And despite the fact that I, in the presence of all other Central Committee members tried to persuade him not to resign, and he still insisted. After all that, I decided that he should remain member of the Central Committee, and I offered him another job as a government minister. Probably I should have met his wish, because he wanted to become a pensioner. He wanted to become a pensioner. Or I should have sent him as ambassador to a citrus republic or banana republic.
There's an interesting little item in the book right at that point where he seems to try to commit suicide, which I had never heard before.
В книге говорится, что он даже имитировал попытку самоубийства. В книге говорится, что он даже имитировал попытку самоубийства. Yes, indeed, that happened. I didn't invent anything.
Why don't you tell
What
the story?
I described with some restraint. Может быть, вы расскажете, как это было? Well, other than what is in the book, I really would not want, it would not be an ethical thing for me to do to say more. Well, you have not read the book yet, right? The audience? And then, okay, I will tell you. After the plenum was over and the plenum decided to relieve him of his duties, according to his request, a few days later, Yeltsin called me and he asked me that he wanted to stay. And to me, I thought it was some kind of a misunderstanding, total confusion. I said, let us have a plenum of the city committee and let us discuss everything as we did at the central committee plenum, and let us address this issue. Then Yeltsin attended the celebration to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the October Revolution. But suddenly after that, probably on the 9th of November, I was told that Yeltsin's associates saw him sitting in a waiting room, and he was all covered with blood. I was flabbergasted. I was shocked. And within minutes, medical help was given to him. He was taken to the hospital. Apparently, he had injured himself a little bit below the heart. With the scissors, the scissors did not really penetrate deep into his body. And for those who wondered what had happened, why is it that he was in that kind of a condition, they said that, well, he kind of fell accidentally on the scissors that were on the table. Nothing terrible actually happened, but I think it showed that he was psychologically, clearly losing control of himself.
Should he resign now?
Ему сейчас надо выйти в отставку. What should be done now is that he should act courageously, and he should muster courage to say that, well, my health is such that we should not leave the country. without this, without leadership.
Зная опыт работы в условиях, когда болеет первое лицо
I
в
saw
государстве,
how we were working when the number one person in our country, when the top leaders of our country were ill.
а я 7 лет работал
For 7
в
years,
Политбюро,
I was working in the Politburo.
больном,
For 4 years under Leonid Brezhnev, who was ill,
3 года при больном
and then 3 years under Andropov and Chernenko, who also were ill.
So that's a yes, he should step.
So it's a very, very difficult situation when this happens.
потеряли, может быть, самые
We lost perhaps the most valuable years
надо было принимать решения,
when decisions had to be taken, when problems were really knocking at our doors,
окнами, дверьми.
but no one was actually listening to those knocks, and the problems were not addressed. I believe that for Russia it's very important that the president himself should decide, and that he should decide to step down. He can do it.
И я думаю, Россия в этом
And Russia, I think,
должна бы создать определенные
if he does that, should provide the necessary guarantees for the president, should take good care of him, but the constitutional process should be open for a transfer, for transition.
драка политическая.
Unless this is done, instability, infighting, intrigue will only grow, and this will make the situation in Russia extremely complicated, whereas what Russia needs today is firm,
руководстве, ответственном руководстве.
responsible leadership, dynamic leadership.
If he does step down
Если он
for
уйдет,
about 90 days,
То 90
Chernomyrdin
дней
takes
Черномырдин
over.
будет руководить страной.
Do you think Chernomyrdin would be a good leader?
Вы считаете, Черномырдин был бы хорошим лидером?
Ну, жизнь покажет.
Well, life will show.
Do you think that if Chernomyrdin takes over,
Ну,
there will be
если он,
elections within 90 days? Or is there a
придет к
danger
власти,
that
будут выборы
Chernomyrdin
через
and perhaps
90 дней?
Zhuganov
Или есть опасность того, что
could subvert the
Черномырдин
constitutional process?
подорвет конституционный процесс?
Такая опасность есть.
There is such a danger.
Какая-то возня идет между Черномырдиным и
Something is happening between Chernomyrdin and the communists. Some kind of collusion is happening between them.
Я думаю, что это не годится.
And I think that's a bad idea.
Если Черномырдин по Конституции
If
получает
Chernomyrdin
президента, то и дальше процесс должен развиваться по
gets,
Конституции.
obtains the authority of the president according to the Constitution, then the process should continue according to the Constitution rather than against the Constitution.
Iначе это уже будет
Otherwise, we're going to have a situation that will be quite different, and to that, the nation, the society would respond very dramatically. I believe that even though this is difficult, we should move ahead within the constitutional framework.
Is Zhuganov a dangerous man?
Зюганов опасный человек?
сам по себе Зюганов не опасен,
Oh, well, in and of himself, Zyuganov is not dangerous.
но его
But
окружение
people around him, in his entourage,
внушает мне большие сомнения, что им можно давать власть.
are very questionable people. I don't believe that they should get power.
Там ведь немало в этом окружении тех, кто в августе
Among his
91 года
associates,
сорвал
in
подписание.
his entourage, there are many people who in August 1991 made it impossible to sign the Union Treaty, made it impossible to implement the economic program, made it impossible to change the CPSU. We should not give them power.
Сделать, чтобы эта партия
We
была
should
другой.
get rid of them. But in order to do so, the party must change.
Тот случай,
But the
когда
party has not yet changed. This is very different from Eastern European countries,
где на базе
where
рабочих
the former communist and workers' parties have changed. And we now have parties of a social democratic reformist kind. They are in favor of reforms. And those are parties that are new, whose leaders are new.
российской компартии
In Russia, the Communist Party is a party that has frozen. There is no renewal there, no renovation there. It includes many people who tried to slow down reforms and who threw monkey wrenches in the process of reform. They are not at all reliable. So on the one hand, you have Zyuganov, and on the other hand, you have his entourage. He is not a free man.
Do you think if there were elections now,
Считаете ли вы, что если сейчас
General
будут
Lebed would
выборы,
win?
генерал Лебедь на них победит?
Если сегодня были бы выборы,
If the elections were to be held today, General Lebed would win,
вот
yes.
что он бы делал, получив
But what he would do having gotten power, that's a different question. He needs
он нуждается в том, чтобы рядом была команда.
someone around him, some people around him that would create an experienced team, a team of people who have experience in the economy, politics, and international relations, a team of people who are committed to democracy. With such a team, Lebed could really show his positive potential. But if
Неопытным президентом
together with a young and inexperienced president, you would have people who would be playing a very different card,
то я не знаю.
then I don't know whether Lebed will be able to measure up to this job, whether he will be able to continue
Поэтому
movement toward democracy and reform. So what
процесс
I would like to see is a certain process. Within that process, there will be all kinds of coalitions, all kinds of teams, and they will seek power. This is the right thing to do, for people to observe, to watch, and to choose. Any other approach is dangerous.
Who would you choose?
Кого бы вы выбрали?
Lebed, Zhuganov, Chernomyrdin,
Лебедя,
if there were
Зюганова,
elections?
Черномырдина или кого-то другого, если бы были выборы?
я голосовал на
well,
выборах Ельцина и против Зюганова.
During the final round of the elections, I voted against both Yeltsin and Zyuganov.
Я не думаю, что Черномырдин
I don't think that Chernomyrdin
сегодня готов, чтобы взять на себя
is a person who is ready to assume responsibility for our country.
Я сказал, при каких условиях
I
я бы
said
поддержал Лебедя,
that under certain conditions I would support Lebed, that is to say, if he is assisted by a team of real reformers and Democrats.
But suppose Lebed won. You have
Допустим,
been
Лебедь победит.
one of the strongest.
Допустим, Лебедь победит. Вы один из
You
самых
have been one of the strongest opponents of NATO expansion.
решительных оппонентов расширения НАТО.
But if the West and
Но
the
если
United States,
Запад,
facing a
США,
government led by Lebed or Zhuganov,
столкнется с правительством во главе с Лебедем или с
how would you
Зюгановым,
argue
то
against
как
the
можно
United
убедить
States
Соединенные
if it
Штаты,
wanted to
другие страны
move ahead with NATO
не
expansion?
расширять НАТО?
ну это мы с вами занимаемся гаданием на кофейной гуще.
Well, this is so much guesswork, all of it.
Потому что надо исходить совсем из других.
What we should do is think quite differently.
Была НАТО и
NATO
Варшавский договор.
existed when the Warsaw Pact also existed,
Заключая договоры
when
об объединении Германии,
the treaties regarding the unification of Germany were concluded.
мы
We
договорились, что
reached an understanding that NATO would not be extending its sphere of influence even to East Germany.
ну а других странах вообще не могло
It
быть.
would not extend its zone of operation to East Germany, and as for other countries, there was not even a question of that, because that would have meant that NATO would extend to the Warsaw Treaty. So what was the solution that we found at that time?
И по пути
We said
формирования
that
структур
we should
европейских.
move ahead to build common European institutions, institutions for cooperation and security for all of Europe, including Europeans, the United States, and Canada.
Я внес предложение созвать
I proposed that
на высшем
there should be a meeting,
такая встреча.
a summit meeting in Paris of all those countries, and this happened in November 1990, which adopted the Charter of Paris for a united Europe.
Вот так и развивалось,
So
собственно.
this is how things were evolving at that time. As soon as the Soviet Union was no more,
Появились
the West, some people in the West were tempted to fish in troubled waters,
ловля.
and this fishing is continuing.
Я думаю, это мелкая
I think this is a kind of petty political game.
Правда, и Россия руку приложила.
Unfortunately, Russia too is to blame
На Западе подозрение.
for
Что я
the West
считаю,
being
что
suspicious.
и западная,
And therefore, I believe that both Western policies and Russian policies are dragging us into something that is very bad, that is unnecessary. Instead of building a real cooperation in Europe, instead of showing in Europe an example to the world, this is what always happened, and this should happen now. Instead of creating guarantees that the United States too participates in building a united Europe, instead of moving in the right direction, well, the question is of NATO expansion. If this is done, then we could have a situation when our two countries will again, so to say, part company, will go their separate ways. When Secretary Perry came to Russia and talked to members of the parliament, the State Duma, you know how he was received. I wouldn't want to dramatize the situation, but there was no mutual understanding in that talk, in that discussion. And if you
Was
look
that
at our...
Yeltsin's fault, if you could ask him?
Ну что, это Ельцин
Blame Yeltsin
виноват,
for
что
that?
так получилось, что вот с НАТО такая ситуация?
я думаю, что и те, и другие, и Запад.
Well, I think both sides are to blame, are at fault for this kind of situation.
Не надо
So
возвращаться к старым.
let us make sure that we do not return to the past, to the old methods. Let us look to the future.
Европа нужна
And Europe needs integration, and a strong and stable Europe,
созданная, формирующаяся с участием Соединенных Штатов,
which will also include the United States and Canada, will be an important center that would provide balance in the situation in the world, because you see how new centers of power are emerging in the East,
и в Тихоокеан,
in the Pacific,
в Азиатском регионе.
in the Asia-Pacific
What are the
region.
dangerous powers emerging? Are you talking about China?
Имеете в виду, что есть опасные силы, которые возникают? Вы говорите о Китае?
Вы знаете, опасные силы тогда возникает, когда
Well,
разбалансировано.
danger is when the situation is out of balance. This is dangerous.
Вот как только
As soon as
автомобили
in a
исчезает,
car
система торможения,
you don't have a brake, or you don't have
возникает опасность. Так вы едете,
controls,
всё нормально.
then it's dangerous.
Нужно нажать педаль.
But when you are driving and controlling the car, you use the accelerator, you use the gas pedal, you use the brakes. There should be a balance in a car. Similarly, in the world,
Они разрушают.
there should be a balance. The pillars of order in the world should balance each other.
Очень плохо, если на
It would be very bad
только с
if
позиции сегодняшнего дня.
politicians thought only about
С
today,
позиции того, как
or
выиграть.
only about how to win the elections.
А есть и более серьезные вещи.
There are more serious things.
I'm sorry to be simple on this, but I take it balance means containing China.
Ну, я, может быть, упрощаю, но, по-моему, вы имеете в виду баланс, и это означает сдерживать Китай.
Я все имею в виду.
Well, I have all kinds of things in mind. That is to say, the entire geopolitical situation that should be balanced.
Okay. Let me take you. I'll stop there.
Хорошо, на этом тогда я
Let me take
остановлюсь.
you back, if I can.
Если можно, я бы
The
хотел
history
вернуться
that you've
немножко
written
назад,
about.
к истории, о которой вы писали в своей
It's
книге.
been said that when you visited Czechoslovakia
Вы
in
говорите, что в
1969,
1968 году
it's
вы
when you
посетили
first
Чехословакию, когда вы
began to
впервые,
believe that the system
что вот
couldn't
тогда
work.
вам уже начинало казаться, что система не работает, не может работать.
В 69 году.
That was in 69 rather than 68,
Год после
a year after the events in Czechoslovakia.
я увидел, что
I saw
люди просто не
that
приняли,
people had not
как
accepted
поступили с ними
what
сами.
happened. They disagreed with how their allies treated them.
Я видел, сколько
I
горечи,
saw
обиды было у
the bitterness and the frustration of the people there. And that was the first time when I began to think that perhaps things are not as nice and smooth as our propaganda was describing. In Brno, with other members of the Soviet delegation, and by the way, that delegation included Mr. Ligachev too, and this is where we met. So with those other members of the delegation, we were walking in the shop of one of the factories, and people didn't want to talk to us. They turned their backs on us. I felt that people had not accepted this kind of attitude, this kind of treatment. Had we not invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, had our troops not gone there, had we worked together with the Czechs to discuss what kind of reforms we needed, Czechoslovakia and other Warsaw Pact countries, then we would have been more successful in the process of reforms, because when we actually started the reforms, it was in a situation of a kind of earthquake. So mistakes, very serious mistakes were made. And in politics, you pay a very dear price for mistakes.
Right. So when you came into power in
Когда вы пришли к власти в 1985 году,
did you have a clear vision
у вас было какое-то четкое представление,
of where you wanted things to go, or were you
куда
just
надо идти, или
trying to fix
вы
the
старались
most serious
просто
problem?
что-то отремонтировать?
Did you actually believe that the
Какие-то проблемы
Soviet Union
устранить?
would
Считали ли
become
вы, что
democratic?
Советский Союз
that
может
the
стать
Soviet Union might
демократической
break
страной? И опасались ли вы, что Советский Союз может распасться? Well, you've asked several questions. Yesterday I was answering questions, Charlie Rose, on the Charlie Rose show, and I said that any attempt to impose on any society an artificial model always required the use of force, always required dictatorship, always required barbaric means, and that always had very severe consequences. I saw how the imposition of the communist model in the Soviet Union and in other countries, how damaging it was. It created a model that was only holding up because of the bayonets, because of the use of force, and it hampered the development of civilization in a number of countries. And I understood that a living society should not be forced into a model, into some kind of scheme. And therefore, the vision of perestroika was that this is not a menu, that this is not some kind of schedule of trains, that we just had certain guidelines, that we just had certain ideas such as freedom, free elections, glasnost, economic freedom, freedom of conscience. And all of that we thought would make our society free and would make our citizens active, would empower our citizens. And that would create also the framework and the ground rules. And at that time, I didn't have a very full knowledge of the history of the democracy in the United States of America. But even so, I knew a little, and I even wrote a paper as a student about democracy in the United States, and I knew that the same problem was faced by the founding fathers of the United States. When they were drafting the Constitution initially, the idea was to describe the kind of society in which the American people would be living for years and decades and centuries to come. And when they tried to describe describe what kind of a society they wanted, they failed, and therefore it would have ended in failure or in falling out between them. But then they decided to do something different. They decided just to write the ground rules for a democratic society, the ground rules on the basis of which the generations of Americans would try to develop their nation. So that is the right approach, the ground rules, the guidelines, the right choice, and then moving step by step in a very specific situation of a very difficult country, where there was too much military industry, where the party was monopolizing power for decades, where just one form of property, state property, existed. So we had to reform that very difficult country. And if you add the fact that in the Soviet Union we had people who were speaking 225 languages and dialects, you can imagine what kind of country it was to reform. And therefore I understood that we cannot create a blueprint, we cannot create a kind of schedule when something will be achieved. And therefore instead we decided to move step by step as a kind of evolution from something more complicated from something less complicated to more complicated things. But nomenclatura resisted, the bureaucracy resisted that, and therefore we had to undertake political reform. I believe that in some situations we acted decisively and at the right pace as needed by our society. In some other cases we moved too fast when our society was still did not understand what was happening, and sometimes we acted too slow. You're asking about the union. I think that a union could have been preserved, but that would have been a reformed union, a decentralized union. But a breakup, no, that was not necessary. The breakup resulted in a very dramatic situation in both Russia and other republics. People are looking for ways of cooperating, for ways of working together within what used to be a country that had 1,000 years of history. We were too slow, and therefore the separatists were able to move forward. There were some ambitious politicians who were able to play that card of nationalism. So it was a very complicated country, and it was very difficult to manage that process. Finally, we were able to develop a draft union treaty, but then there was this coup, which was a terrible blow. A blow from those who thought that the transition to a new union and new elections based on that treaty would deprive them of their positions, and therefore they placed their vested interest above the interest of the state.
When that coup occurred, you remained General Secretary of the Communist
был
Party.
совершен этот переворот, после попытки переворота вы остались генеральным секретарем Компартии.
In retrospect, would it have been better for you
В ретроспективе,
to have left the
если
party,
смотреть назад, не считаете ли вы, что лучше было бы вам тогда уйти из партии?
especially since Yeltsin was trying to abolish the party?
Особенно учитывая, что Ельцин уже конкретно перешел к ликвидации партии.
Я думаю, что вы забыли, что я
Well, I think you forgot that on the 24th of August,
то есть через 2 дня,
that is to say 2 days after I returned,
что меня предал
when I learned that the Politburo had betrayed me, that most members of the Politburo betrayed me, when I learned that most of the Central Committee secretaries had betrayed me, and as well as most of the regional and local party elite, I said that I relinquished the duties of the General Secretary of the party. I regret very much that I had not been able to complete the process of reforming the party which would have then divided into different parties, conservative party, social democratic party, perhaps a liberal party, and maybe a communist party. But that would have created parties that would have a base of support, that would then divide the property that had belonged to the party. That would have been a very different situation. Democracy then would have a basis for development. What Yeltsin did was, again, breaking the country like a stick, breaking all the institutions of the party. But that is not a way to change the country. You can do that with the firewood in the forest, but that's not the way to work with a country, with a nation. You cannot break it like this. You have to have more than muscle power when you deal with a country like ours.
You describe Yeltsin at that
Вы
moment.
характеризуете Ельцина в этот
as,
момент
Вы
как...
любите Ельцина, я вижу.
You love Yeltsin.
Well, I think he's. You have a lot of Yeltsin in your
У
book.
вас нема... I also do.
Это мой президент.
He is my
You say
president.
he was gloating with sadistic pleasure
Вы
at
говорите,
that
что
moment.
он в этот момент, когда подписывал указ, он
when
просто злорадствовал с
He, I
садистским
think,
удовольствием.
forced through the banning of the Communist Party.
Когда вот он, так сказать, подписал указ о запрете
Do you
коммунистической
think you
партии.
could have fought him? Do you think you should have fought him on that? Stood up to him
Считаете ли
at
вы,
that
что
moment?
вы должны были бы как-то ему воспротивиться при этом, что вы могли бы как-то встать и помешать ему?
То, что я тогда мог,
Well, what I could do in that situation when my
авторитетом
position and when my authority had been undermined,
делал. И прежде
what
всего,
I could do in that situation, I did.
на новый договор.
What I wanted to do and what I was able to do was to prepare a new draft treaty between the republics.
Руководители
And that
республик
draft treaty was prepared, and the leaders of all republics on November 14th, 1991, including Yeltsin,
будет.
they spoke on television and they said that the Union will exist.
Был направлен
The
в Верховный Совет.
Union Treaty, the draft Union Treaty, was then sent
Это было самое
to the
главное
Supreme
направление
Soviet. So that was the most important area where I could resist where I could resist destructive policies.
что я включил
In addition to that,
межгосударственный экономический
I
Явлинского,
included Mr. Yavlinsky in the Inter-Republican Economic Committee, and at the same time that we were developing the Union Treaty between the republics, Yavlinsky was working on an economic treaty between the republics, and republics, including Ukraine, supported that treaty. In that way, I was preparing the basis for reforming the country, reforming the Union, but for preserving a common economic and political area. And when Yeltsin saw that in an open fight, in an open battle with Gorbachev, he would not succeed, when he saw that all of those attempts in an open battle were failing, then he intrigued behind my back, and he did what he did. This is the kind of morality that he espouses. This is the kind of person that he is.
Well, let me move on then to another person.
Хорошо, тогда к другому человеку перейдем.
Ronald Reagan.
К Рональду Рейгану.
You talk about being by the fireplace with him at
Вы
the first
пишете,
summit
как вы
and
говорили
at
с ним
Reykjavik.
у камина в
speak of
Женеве,
him very
в
warmly.
Рейкьявике. Вы очень тепло о нем
Then you,
пишете,
you also say he had
потом вы
a
говорите.
dislike for detail.
Что Рейган не любил детали. Что Рейган не любил детали. Что Рейган не любил детали.
Did he know what he was doing when he was
Он вообще
negotiating with
знал,
you?
что он делает? Он представлял себе, чем он занимается?
Я думаю, что вы лучше знаете.
Well, I think you know best. You know better than I do.
Но я вам скажу, это
But let me tell you, I
президент
regard him as a president
выдающийся.
who was outstanding.
Независимо от того, какие
Regardless
недостатки
of
у всех
his
есть,
shortcomings, and all of us have some,
идеальные люди только в пробирках были.
people are perfect only in test tubes.
Так вот,
Do you think? Okay.
так вот, этот человек
So
стал партнером.
this is the person who became my counterpart, my partner in ending the nuclear arms race, my partner in concluding the treaty on the elimination of nuclear missiles. He worked with me to create an atmosphere of trust. He also moved with me closer to the START treaty, and together we created the prerequisites to end the Cold War, which then we did. We ended the Cold War working together with George Bush and Jim Baker. When I speak about President Reagan, I also speak about George Shultz.
Этот тандем был
It was a team,
сильным тандемом.
and it was a very strong team.
Я думаю, не откажешь.
And I think that we really cannot deny President Reagan his great instincts, his natural instinct.
Принять решение.
And he had the courage to decide.
В Москву он приехал, и
When he came to Moscow
было уже 80.
in 1988,
Многое изменилось.
a lot had changed by that time.
И он в Кремле сказал,
And he spoke in the Kremlin. He answered the question from a reporter,
что да, он
and he said
нынешний союз.
that at that time he no longer regarded the Soviet Union under Gorbachev as an evil empire.
Это говорит о...
And this shows that he was a serious man.
Так что у меня мнение о президенте
So my view of President Reagan
остается хорошим.
remains positive.
А в остальном вам разбираться.
And as for the rest of it, it's up to you, it's up to the historians to decide what you think.
One more historical question.
Еще один исторический вопрос.
When the Berlin Wall
Когда
began to fall that morning,
началось падение Берлинской стены,
They
вот то
telephoned
утро,
you.
вам звонили.
do you think you should have recommended that they use force to stop
Считаете ли
it?
вы, что следовало бы все-таки порекомендовать им силой это остановить?
Тогда бы мы с вами не беседовали сегодня.
Then we would not be sitting here today.
Это уже был выбор
No.
народа.
No, because I saw that the people have chosen.
И я спросил, какие меры они приняли.
I saw those who called me, what steps they were taking.
Они сказали, что мы не препятствовали.
And they said that they were not hindering the people, that they had no intention to use force.
Я это одобрил.
And I approved that.
Согласился с ним.
I agreed with them.
Why did you run for president this year?
Почему вы решили в этом году баллотироваться в президенты?
Много причин.
There were several reasons.
Первая
The
причина,
first reason
я располагал информацией, что
was that I had the information that there was an intention to cancel the elections
перенесут.
or to postpone the elections.
Теперь, когда Коржаков
And now, when Mr. Korzhakov and some of his associates, Barsukov and others, are no longer in power, Korzhakov has already confessed, has admitted that they were suggesting to the president to cancel the elections. So my information at that time was correct. And that would have been bad news for Russia. We want Russia, in all matters, to play by the ground rules of democracy. We want that to become an entrenched tradition. We want that to become a necessity in the country, just like water, air, and bread.
общенациональные выборы, тогда что
So
получится
if
демократия?
they treat national elections in this way, I said, what would happen to our democracy? And I knew that if I ran in the presidential campaign, they would not be able to just cancel the elections. So that was my first argument. My second reason was that for 5 years I lived in a kind of information blackout.
И я решил использовать
And I decided to take advantage of this official possibility in order to engage in an open dialogue with the Russian people, because a lot of things had been said to the Russian people. Yeltsin and his team and the communist press and the government media had told the people so many lies about Mikhail Gorbachev that people were confused. And therefore I used this to tell people the truth, and I did that. Yeltsin, by the way, during the presidential campaign, did not really account to the people, did not report to the people about his actions. I gave people that kind of an account of my activity and of also what happened after me. Wherever I came, all auditoriums were filled to capacity. Filled to capacity. People came, and sometimes, I spoke to groups of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people, answering questions for hours, which means that people wanted to hear from me. They wanted to hear my evaluations. I spoke out, and after the elections, I am a more confident man. Now, what about the result? What about the result? Why was the result what it was? Well, I think that the analogy with Jesus Christ might be useful here, but maybe let us not go that far. Let us not go that far. Remember, the criminal, the bandit, was spared by the crowd when it was suggested that one of them could be spared, and they spared the criminal, and Jesus Christ was pelted with stones and then was crucified. You remember that? But that's not an explanation. That's not an explanation so far as I am concerned, but just it gives you, I think, food for thought, because about the fate of reformers, You can see that today I am here, we are talking, so I was able to climb the political Mount Everest, and then I descended from the Mount Everest, and I am alive, and I'm active. And as for the vote and how people voted, they would have voted for a united candidate if Lebed, Gorbachev, Yavlinsky, and Fedorov united and had one candidate. But we did not have enough time to reach an arrangement. But even the first step toward uniting scared Yeltsin, and therefore he bought out Lebed with his promises. He gave some money to Professor Fedorov, and he did not really run, and he split our coalition. If we had had a coalition with a united candidate, I'm sure that that coalition could have won the election. I believe that today the most important task in our domestic politics is to build a coalition that would be an alternative to the current regime, and to a possible attempt of the communists once again to get power, to come to power.
That's a great note to end on. So I wanted to now turn to the questions from the audience.
Закончили на хорошей ноте ваши ответы на мои вопросы, а теперь вопросы из аудитории.
And this one, I don't know who wrote it. You can raise your hand because it's a nice question.
Не знаю, чей вопрос.
What would you do about Chechnya? And P.S. Thank you for ending the Cold War.
Что вы думаете по поводу Чечни? Постскриптум, спасибо за окончание холодной войны. I think that certainly the war in Chechnya must be ended. What is more important, it should never have been started. When on November 26, 1994, the Russian government presented an ultimatum to Dudayev, the president of Chechnya, I said that I was against moving troops into Chechnya. I said I am from the Caucasus myself. I know the history of the Caucasus. I know the place. And I said from the start that as a minimum, we're going to have a lot of bloodshed, a bloodbath. We might even get another Caucasian War, another war in the Caucasus. And also, I suggested that I might add as an intermediary. And Dudayev called me and he agreed to accept my services as a go-between. Yeltsin rejected that. At that time, his popularity was so low that all polls showed that only 4 to 5% of the people supported him. So he wanted to have that little war in order to become more popular, to show that the president was active. So this is the favorite method of many presidents and governments to raise their prestige by some kind of military action. I think you have been there too. So I was against that war. During the war, I submitted twice a package of proposals about how to end the war. I don't know whether you are familiar with the fact that in the war in Chechnya, almost 100,000 people, perhaps more, Russian people died in that war. This is several times more than in Afghanistan, in 10 years in Afghanistan, more than in the 43 years after the death of Stalin. That was a real bloodbath. That is a shameful war. It's a wound on our country, and what Lebed did in ending the war should be consolidated. We should continue the political negotiations, and we should address all the issues to preserve Russia's integrity and at the same time to give Chechnya a special status. This is quite possible. And unless someone crudely interferes in that process, then the formula that preserves the integrity of Russia and gives Chechnya a special status will make it possible to end that terrible tragedy. A few days ago, probably 2 days ago, Chernomyrdin said on behalf of the government that the process of political settlement in Chechnya will be continued, and I welcome this. I welcome this.
The next question is about American foreign policy of containment, the containment doctrine. That for 40 years, U.S. policy was based on containing the Soviet Union. Do you believe that policy was justified?
Well, I think that today I cannot approve either the policy of one camp, of one side in the Cold War, or the policy of the other side in the Cold War. Instead of working together as allies after World War II, after the defeat of Nazism, they started what we then called the Cold War. They started to divide the world, and there was a terrible confrontation in the world, and that absorbed enormous resources, the resources that we needed in our own countries and the resources that we also needed for other countries where there's a lot of poverty, where there is so little development, where there is hunger, where there is disease. Our two countries alone, that is to say, the Soviet Union and the United States alone, spent $10 trillion each in the Cold War. Today, in Russia, people applaud when the International Monetary Fund gives us like $100 million. But that's ridiculous. So I think that the fact that we ended the Cold War, the fact that we ended this confrontation, the confrontation for which former politicians, previous politicians are responsible, we did the right thing by ending that dangerous confrontation, by ending that dangerous face-off. So this is my answer.
Do you think that
Считаете ли вы, что
Pope John Paul II
Папа Иоанн Павел
had
II
influence
имел влияние
on the eventual downfall of the Soviet Union.
на события, которые привели в конечном счете к распаду Советского Союза.
Я все время в контакте с Папой Римским.
I have maintained friendly contacts with the Pope.
Крупное явление.
I believe that he is a major figure in history. I regard him as a person
Для которого гуманизм
for
является
whom
самым главным ориентиром.
humanism is the most important guidepost, for whom human life is the supreme value. He is a person who is reflecting, who is thinking about our world, about its problems, about its difficulties, and he pays tribute to political leaders regardless of which side or which alliance they represent. He is a person who is humane, he is a person who believes in universal values of democracy.
В этом смысле
So if you are asking your question in that sense, yes, indeed, his activity has been important for all, for Roman Catholics and members of other religions and those who are not religious believers. But I totally reject the speculation that the Pope was
участвовал
almost a kind of
в политической борьбе. Нет, я
someone who was participating in political intrigues.
я мог это констатировать.
No, I cannot say that, and I will not say that. I believe that his position, just like the position of other religious leaders, was aimed at preserving peace and helping people who are in hardships, and this position deserves support. So I value and appreciate him for that. Next November, I will have another meeting with the Pope because I will be visiting Italy, and I'll be talking to him. If he gives me some new information, I will then convey it to you.
Can you comment on the current level of tolerance for religious minorities in Russia these
Вы
days,
не могли
specifically
бы
Jews?
сказать, какое сегодня отношение к религиозным меньшинствам в России, в частности, к евреям?
Я думаю, что все-таки нормально.
Well, I think it's a fairly good
Закон,
attitude.
который принят
There is a law
еще в
in
85
effect in my country that was adopted
Все конфессии
on my initiative,
правами.
about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Various religions have equal rights. Of course, they have different influence.
Действуют и другие религии.
Certainly, Russian Orthodox Church is the biggest, but Islam is also a factor. Other religions are also playing important roles. I met with religious leaders many times. Now, Orthodox churches are being built, mosques are being built, synagogues are being built,
И буддийские
and Buddhist temples are being built. The country,
в этом смысле свободны.
in that sense, is a free country because people are free, all religious confessions are free to act within the framework of total freedom.
В дискуссиях,
In my debates,
когда на эту тему
in my discussions, I even said that I would not want religion to be politicized. I don't want the Russian Orthodox Church to be politicized. I don't want Islam
проблемами морали,
or any other religion to be politicized. I believe that religious leaders should be concerned with morality. They should be concerned with protecting and supporting the people. I believe that religion can play a great role for many, many years and centuries to come, particularly in times of difficulty and trial.
Have you become more religious?
Вы сами не стали ли более религиозным?
я не могу стать более религиозным,
Well, I cannot become more religious
что я был,
because
не относил себя к верующим.
I never was religious.
Я человек крещенный.
I was christened, I was baptized.
Бабушки мои обе,
My grandmothers, both of them, both the one on my mother's side and on my father's side, were religious believers, and they had profound faith. In my home, I had a situation when my grandfather was a communist and my grandmother was very religious, but my grandfather had great respect for her beliefs, even though communists were supposed to combat religion. You will read in my book that in my home, I remember in the home of my grandmother Vasilisa, grandmother on my mother's side, there were icons and there was a religious lamp, but there were also portraits of Lenin and Stalin in the same home. In the same home. The full complement, peaceful coexistence. And by the way, this was embedded in my memory. This was imprinted in my memory. And when I was writing the book, I recalled that and I described that. But the fact that I recognize and understand the role of religion, that's without question. I recognize that a free individual should have freedom to choose his beliefs, also freedom to choose his party and ideology. That is without question.
Do you feel there is a future for
Считаете ли вы,
communism
что коммунизм
or
имеет
socialism in
будущее,
any
что
form?
социализм в какой-то форме имеет будущее? I think that the future will not be a choice between capitalism and socialism. At the end of the 20th century, the situation is that the whole world is facing a crisis. The world needs new guideposts for the future. And none of the existing ideologies, liberal ideology, conservative ideology, or socialist ideology, has been able to provide answers to the challenges of our times. And that means that we are moving toward a new civilization, a civilization that will be a fusion, a synthesis of the various experiences. We will need the liberal values of freedom, because without freedom we will not have a future, but we will also have a need for socialistic values such as justice, solidarity. I see that those feelings are cultivated in America today. I can tell you that you have more socialism than we had in some of the countries that call themselves socialist. And I don't think that this is bad. There is nothing tragic about this. There will be different people, and different people will espouse different values. Some people are committed to conservative values. Others are committed to liberal or to democratic values. But all of them will probably come around to the conclusion that society should be just. Of course, not a society where everything is equated, where there is no initiative. But there are people who are poor. There are people who need support from the state, who need a safety net. Someone has to think about them. We cannot throw people out. They are not rejects. They are not waste. And that means that you will have to work on the issues of justice. And you will have to think about equality, not, of course, the kind of equality that we have when there is an oligarchy that really swims in money, that really some of those newly rich people in our country are really crazily rich. At the same time, people who represent small business, medium-sized business, the intelligentsia, scientists, they cannot succeed. They are paid so little a lot less than those who are in those upper echelons in our country. That is not normal. There should be some kind of social partnership. It is because of the idea of social partnership that we see in the West that the interests of different segments of the population have been harmonized. We should not reject this. But social partnership, solidarity, those are elements from the socialist ideology. So we will need all those elements and other elements to build a house. We need brick, we need cement, we need wood, we need chemicals, we also need toilets and baths. We'll need all of that. So to build a new society, in the new society we'll need to use all those positive gains as a result of the history of mankind. So let's not take things to extremes. Let us not really set different people against each other and different ideas against each other. We're all human. We all face global challenges, particularly the environment, and we must unite rather than divide. And let us put an end to those useless ideological debates. Let us agree that we shall build a new relationship with nature, that we should build a new information society. Let us agree how we deal with the globalization of the world, when people are afraid that this could deprive them of their identity, of their language, of their culture. So let us think what to do about all those things. And whatever will be helping to solve those tasks is good.
I think that's a great note to end on, except for that there's one question from Yuri Gorbachev, is that here? That says, while you were president, your wife worked very closely in furthering culture in Russia. What has become of all her wonderful programs? And I figured you may want to say something nice about them as a last word.
С культурными программами с этими.
Ну, я могу сказать, если уж мы завершаем, для ответа на...
Since we are concluding, perhaps I don't think that maybe Mrs. Gorbachev, maybe she would like to answer.
Пока...
I think I got him in trouble.
Вопрос о том, что произошло с культурными программами, которые вы развивали на администрации деятельности президента. Вы активно участвовали в культурных программах, что с ними произошло?
Пока Раиса Максимовна осваивается со сценой,
While Mrs. Gorbachev is settling down,
собирается с мыслями,
and while she is also composing her thoughts,
я хочу... Ну так, мы партнеры, друзья.
We are friends and partners. We work like this. We've been working like this for many years. I would like to say that I received support from Mrs. Gorbachev not only in the field of culture.
Самую большую поддержку я получил.
The most important support for me was her support, the support of my wife, and I am very grateful to her for this support in everything. Да, чуть поближе только, кстати. Нет, ничего. Нет, микрофон вот этот вот, и чуть поближе, Раиса Максимовна. Сделай. Вот, да.
Все-таки меня вытеснят.
Okay, I'm being squeezed out.
It's happened before.
Вот так. Так, немножко близко, вот так хорошо, да.
На этот вечер мне очень приятен и подарок для меня.
This has been a wonderful evening, and
Горбачев так высоко оценил мои
the fact that Mr. Gorbachev has spoken so highly about me is wonderful.
Да. Я думаю, что моя главная задача состояла
I
в
think that
жизни
my principal task in life,
поддерживать его
in my life, has been to give him support,
не только тогда, когда он был
not only
президентом,
in the years when he was president,
а считаю, что очень важно,
but I think it
пока у
is
меня были силы, поддержать его
very
в эти
important
годы.
also to support him during these last years,
После 91 года.
after 1991,
Потому что это тоже годы
because those years too
серьезных испытаний.
have been the years of very major difficulties and tribulations.
Как-то Горбачев приводил пример,
Mr. Gorbachev
что на Эверест
has once
поднималось в
said
мире
that
120.
120 groups climbed
Погибло
Mount
около
Everest,
40% людей.
and about 40%
Около
or
трети погибло.
1/3 of them
Ага. Но
died,
40% из них
and
погибло при
40% of
спуске
those
с Эвереста.
died during the descent from Mount Everest.
Да.
That is a fact.
И действительно, особенно
And it is true that
в условиях
particularly
России, того, что
in Russia,
Горбачев реформатор,
given the fact that Mr.
и вы
Gorbachev
знаете
was
историю
a
России,
reformer, you know the history of Russia,
наверное, это первый
you
глава российского
know that he is
государства,
probably the first Russian leader
который
who
остался жив,
remained
уйдя
alive
с поста.
after leaving his position.
И не просто остался жив,
Not just alive,
остался в
but
политике.
he is involved in
И
politics.
сегодня люди
And today,
в России,
people in Russia,
ну, конечно, думающие люди, тот,
the
кто
thinking
понимает
people,
ситуацию,
those who understand
говорят
the
то, что
situation,
Горбачев
they
продолжает
say
оставаться
that
в России,
Gorbachev, the fact
отстаивать
that
свою позицию.
Gorbachev remains in Russia, the fact that Gorbachev continues to speak out,
Это есть его второй гражданский подвиг.
really his second act of great civic heroism.
Это все тоже продолжение борьбы
This is the continuation of
за
his battle, the
демократическую
battle
Россию.
for democracy, the
её
battle for a
будущее.
democratic Russia, the battle for Russia's future.
Ну, а теперь по тому
Now,
вопросу, которому попросили
that
меня ответить.
question that was put to me, let me say a few words.
Я тоже как-то прошла свой путь самостоятельно, училась,
I had my
работала.
own path in life. I studied, I worked.
Представитель нашей российской
and,
интеллигенции,
At some point, members of
которая
the Russian
полностью
intelligentsia,
разделила
those who fully shared
те идеи, с которыми пришла перестройка в
the
страну.
ideas of perestroika.
И я была в числе тех,
Um,
той части интеллигенции, которая включилась в
And I was
демократические
among them.
процессы.
We
И я, в частности,
became involved
приняла
in the
активное
process of
участие в
building
создании
democracy
первой,
in our
подумайте,
country.
первой неправительственной
And I
организации в
was
России.
actively involved in creating one of the first non-government
Теперь даже
organizations
это
in
кажется
Russia.
странным.
Just
Это был фонд
think about
культуры.
one of the first non-government
Теперь
organizations
уже
in Russia.
сотни у нас
That
неправительственных
seems strange
организаций
today.
общественных.
When we had hundreds
это
of
была
such
первая.
non-governmental organizations. At that time, the Culture Fund, with which I was working, was the first such
Мы
organization.
работали вместе с Дмитрием
We
Сергеевичем
worked
Лихачевым.
together
Возможно,
with
кто-то знает
Dr.
этого
Dmitry
человека,
Likachev.
академика.
Some of you may have heard about that person,
многие другие.
an outstanding academic,
Но
and
мы
with
считаем,
a
что
number
кое-что
of
мы
other people.
сделали
We believe that we succeeded in
для
some of our
восстановления
projects
очень
in
многих
rebuilding
имен, забытых в
culture
России.
in restoring some names in the Russian culture
Для установления
that were
связей
unjustly forgotten, in rebuilding
с
links
культурой других
and
стран, для
ties with the
возвращения
culture
культурных
of other
ценностей
countries.
в
Also,
Россию
in returning to
и
Russia
так далее.
some cultural artifacts and values.
В 1991 году,
In 1991,
после путча,
after the coup,
когда я была больна,
when I was ill,
Хароса,
after our isolation in the
я очень
Crimea,
болезненно
I
восприняла
was very
то,
resentful
что
of the
Дмитрий
fact
Сергеевич Лихачев
that Dr. Likachev
поспешил
hastily
наш фонд культуры, который был
decided to
объединял все
dismantle our
республики,
culture fund, which united all
расчленить,
the republics.
выделив фонд
So
российской
he
культуры
dismantled that
только.
and singled out the Russian
Я
culture
считала,
fund.
что политика
believed
есть политика,
Politics
а фонд
is
культуры,
politics,
который,
whereas
целью
the
которого
culture
было
fund,
сближение
whose goal
культур разных
is
народов,
to bring together the cultures of
должен был
different
продолжать
natures,
свою
that
работу.
should have continued to work as it
И мы в
was.
такой же мере, как
And,
должны поддерживать
in the
связь
same
с
way that we
американской
should,
культурой, французской,
Maintain
также
ties
с
and
культурой
relations with the
народов
cultures of
Литвы, Латвии,
America,
Прибалтики,
France,
Узбекистана и
and other
так далее.
countries. We should also maintain cultural
Я
ties
выступила
with
против
peoples of
этого,
Lithuania, Latvia,
написала письмо,
Uzbekistan,
что я не
and other
разделяю
former
эту
Soviet
позицию,
republics. And
и
therefore I
вышла из
wrote a
состава
letter
Президиума Фонда
that I
культуры.
do not share this position and I withdrew from the board of the Culture Fund.
Он сегодня, этот фонд,
Today
продолжает
the
существовать.
fund
Его
continues to
возглавляет
exist.
Михалков,
It
наш
is headed
талантливый
by
кинорежиссер.
a talented cinema director,
Но я
Mr.
конкретно
Michalkov,
отошла от
but
деятельности
I'm
этого
not
фонда.
actively involved in the fund.
И сейчас, сколько у меня есть сил, я
And,
занимаюсь
Whatever
гуманитарной
strength I
деятельностью
have today, I give to
в рамках
various
фонда
charitable
Горбачева,
activities within the
гуманитарной
Gorbachev
деятельности.
Foundation.
There are very few people in history
В истории мало людей,
who by their lives have made the world a more
которые
peaceful
своей
place.
жизнью сделали
I think
мир
I speak for
более
all of us in this
безопасным. И я
room
думаю, что могу от имени
say
всех
how
присутствующих
profoundly and deeply honored we
сказать,
are
что мы
to
очень
spend time with such a man.
благодарны, мы считаем для
Thank
себя
you very
честью
much.
с вами быть сегодня.